So in your book, Friend of Science, Friend of Faith, you ask and answer 3 questions. Let's talk a little bit about each of those questions. The first is, does the infallibility of Scripture rest on a literal interpretation of the verses in question? So how did you answer that?
Yeah, so to give a little context for listeners, as I mentioned in the beginning, the book is really written for Christians who are interested or struggling with this. So there's a starting assumption of the truth of the Bible. So when something in science brings up a question or it appears to be in conflict with the scriptures, the first question is not, well, how strong is the scientific evidence, or is the Bible really true? We're starting with an assumption that the Bible is true, but being willing and having humility to realize that the Bible and my understanding of the Bible are not always the same thing. So the Bible can be true, but my understanding of that be off. So the first question is starting to get at that. It's saying, when there's this apparent conflict, my first reaction should not be, oh, that science can't be right, but all right, let God's creation drive me back to Scripture to take another look. So that first question is looking at, and it's usually a question about, when it's a statement about nature, is that passage intended to be taken literally, or is there a different interpretation that's equally biblically defensible, that's not a literal interpretation, that would possibly no longer be in conflict with the Bible? So the easiest way to illustrate that is with a historical example. So if we were alive in the 1600s, and we were to read verses like, and I gotta have to make sure that I get this right here. So if we look at the Psalms, and we look at a verse that's in Psalm 93 that says, the earth is fixed on its foundations and will not be moved. If you were asked, what does that mean? You're in the 1600s. You might have said, well, it could be 2 things. One is a spiritual understanding of God's care and providence for his creation, that it is assured. A second would be, well, it's just a straightforward statement about the functioning of nature. So then you have guys like Copernicus and Galileo that come along and say, no, well, the earth is really not fixed in space. It is revolving around the sun. It's not the center of the universe, as the verse seems to imply. Well, you have debates then that ensue, where you have some people that argue that anything that the Bible addresses, it intends to instruct on. And in the book, I've referred to that as comprehensive inerrancy. So everything the Bible touches on, it intends to instruct on. But there were other Bible-believing bastions of the Christian faith, like Augustine and John Calvin, that said, no, that God is quite free to use people's understanding of nature at the time to illustrate and tell us about God's character and his relationship with us, something that they referred to as divine accommodation. So if you take those 2 arguments and you go back to Scripture with this question in mind, which people did, then some folks noticed that, well, if you go to another Psalm, Psalm 16, you have a place where David says that God is at his right hand, I will not be moved. So you have that same phrase, that I will not be moved, that it's the same Hebrew words where David's saying, with God at my right hand, I will not be moved. He's obviously not talking about his geographical position, that once he's got God at his right hand, he can no longer step forward, back, left, right. He's fixed in position. No, it's talking about God's providence in his life. So using Scripture to understand Scripture, we can then go back to the other Psalm that says that the earth is fixed on its foundations and will not be moved, that's not a statement about the functioning of nature. It's talking about God's providence over his creation.